When the Titanic sank on the morning of April 15th, 1912, she took with her the lives of around 1,500 people. But these were not the first lives that were lost. I've come to Belfast City to explore the stories of the very first people to die on Titanic. And they were not passengers or crew or occurred during her maiden voyage at all. They were part of the thousands of men who built her. In this episode, we are going to take a look at the men who died during Titanic's construction and explore what it was really like to work here at the shipyard. Welcome to Beyond the Titanic, episode 13, The First Victims. She was the largest ship of her time, a masterpiece of engineering. Sending shockwaves around the world, her maiden voyage would be her last. Just days into her first crossing, RMS Titanic sank in the North Atlantic, taking 1,500 lives with her. Join me as we explore the stories of those who survived and those who witnessed the greatest maritime disaster in history.
100,000 people watched the launch, and Titanic was the pride of Belfast.
Scientists of a joint U.S. French expedition said today they have found wreckage of the ocean liner whose name is a legend, the SS Titanic.
On March 31st, 1909, construction began on Ship 401 here at the Harland and Wolff Shipyard in Belfast City. On the adjacent slipway, Ship 400 was well under construction by this point, work having commenced a few months earlier. The two ships would be built side by side. Ship 400 would later be named the Olympic and Ship 401 Titanic. For the next 2 years, the ship rose from the keel plates up as workmen hammered in over 3 million rivets into the near 2,000 hull plates that would eventually form the shell that would become the Titanic. But it wasn't all plain sailing. In total, 8 men would lose their life during the construction of Titanic. Now, chances are, if anyone died on any modern day construction project, the project would shut down completely until a health and safety audit could take place. But remember, this is the early 1900s. Harland and Wolff not only accepted deaths at the shipyard here, they were expected. They figured that for every 100,000 spent on a ship here, on average, 1 man would lose his life during construction. So that meant on Titanic's case, they expected to lose around 15 men. The fact that only 8 died actually brought them under their estimated loss of life. Now, if you think your job is tough, spare a thought for the workmen here at Harland and Wolff. The work was hard and not for the faint of heart. You worked around 60 hours a week, spread over 6 days. Your day started at around 6 a.m. sharp, and if you were late coming through these gates in the morning, then you weren't killed, but your pay was docked. The average pay here at the shipyard was around £2 a week, but that varied on your skill set and the job you performed here. Workers were permitted 1 week's holiday in the summer, as well as Christmas Day and Easter Sunday. Now that sounds pretty awful, but Harland and Wolff were actually considered quite a reputable employer here in Belfast City. If you got a job here, it was a job for life. And generations of the same family all worked here at the shipyard. They were proud of the work they did here, and it showed in the quality of ships that Harland and Wolff produced. And you were handed one of these. This is an original Harland and Wolff timekeeping board, sort of like your own personal clock-in and out number. You was given it at the beginning of your shift, and you kept it on your persons throughout the day. Should you need to borrow any specialised equipment from the stores here at Harland and Wolff, you handed this to the stores person who kept it as a deposit. Should you damage or lose the equipment, the board was held and your pay was docked. Of course, I have no way of knowing who may have used this timekeeping board or who it may belong to. As far as I'm aware, records like that simply just don't exist. It may have been used on Titanic, It may not have. All I can tell you that it was used here at the shipyard between 1860 and the 1970s. So just over 100 years. The mystery surrounding this little piece of wood is what made me pick it up very early on in my Titanic obsession many years ago, way more than I care to even mention. I can't even remember how much I paid for it or whether it's worth anything, but it is one of the best pieces in my collection. Now, it is said that in total, as a worker, you were allocated 7 minutes throughout the day to use the toilet. This is where your board came in handy again. As you entered, your number was taken down, and as you left, it was again noted down. Should you exceed your allocated time throughout the day of 7 minutes, even by seconds, you guessed it, your pay was docked. Let's just hope you never had a dicky tummy, and none of this standing about talking with your mates or taking selfies in the mirror. Ladies, and some gents also, never ever have I understood the fascination with that. I've never ever been in a public toilet and thought, you know what would make this toilet experience a lot better? A selfie next to the urinal. But each to their own. Now, at the end of your working day here at Harland and Wolff, you will return your timekeeping board to the timekeeping office, where your day's pay would be calculated. And there is a saying that soon developed amongst workers here of no board, no pay. You could spend your whole day grafting here, but if you lost this board, you did not get paid. Now, there is a rumour that workers would storm the timekeeping office at the end of the day, throwing their boards en masse to the timekeeping clerk, thus making it impossible for him to dock any insubordination. Whether that took place or not, we're not entirely sure. I'd like to think it did. But if you had any do-gooders at the yard here, and let's face it, every workplace has them, I certainly know who mine are, they're not going to participate in any such behaviour. Personally, I'd have been all over that, because chances are I'd have ended up owing Harland and Wolff money at the end of my day.
Construction on Titanic progressed well, but she was about to claim her first victim. On April 20th of 1910, 15-year-old Samuel Joseph Scott left his home at 70 Templemore Street and headed to the shipyard for another day's work. Samuel was a catch boy. It was a low-paid job, but a job he reportedly was proud to perform. The rivets that held Titanic together were heated until they were white hot, where they were then plucked out of the furnace and literally thrown high into the air, where the catch boy would then catch it with his equipment. He would then run, often at height, to the riveting team, place it in the hole in the shell plating, and the riveting team would then hammer it into place.
Sadly, on this day, Samuel would not return home. Sometime in the afternoon, he was found lying motionless in a pool of his own blood, and despite the best efforts of his fellow co-workers to save him, he died right here on Titanic's construction slipway. At the inquest into his death a few days later, the coroner concluded that Samuel had died instantly from a fractured skull, and it was concluded that he had fallen from a ladder from height whilst working on the ship. Samuel Scott had become the first person to die at the hands of Titanic. I've come to Belfast City Cemetery, not far from the city centre and the old Harland and Wolff shipyard, and it was here that the body of 15-year-old Samuel Scott was brought to after his death. Now, like most workers at the shipyard, his family lived on the breadline and they couldn't afford a decent burial, so he was buried somewhere here in an unmarked plot. However, in 2011, his grave was relocated and marked with the headstone that you can see just here. In the end, the very thing that ended up taking Samuel's life made him immortal. Because if you think about it, had the Titanic not suffered the fate she did, his name and his grave would have been lost to history. It's just crazy to think that Samuel was just 15 years old at the time of his death. And it makes me think, what was I doing at 15? I was trading Pokemon cards and watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Samuel was working a 60-hour week at the Harland and Wolff shipyard, helping to build the Titanic. Samuel Scott's death marked a pivotal moment in Titanic's construction. His death may have been the first on Titanic, but it certainly would not be the last. And for one family, they would suffer a double loss at the hands of the Olympic-class ships. On June 23rd of 1910, 19-year-old John Kelly, a heater boy who worked at the shipyard alongside his father, became the next person to die on Titanic. In eerie, similar circumstances to Samuel Scott, he too fell from the construction gantry, but unlike Scott, he didn't die instantly. He died sometime later from shock, and he was buried right here in City Cemetery in this unmarked plot. I'd like to think that this tree growing at the base of his grave is sort of like a natural marker of his final resting place, because it makes me kind of sad to think that these young men who were just going to work every single day died on the job and were buried with no sort of memorial or headstone. Another young life lost on the construction of Titanic. November 7th of 1910 saw the next fatality at the Harland and Wolff shipyard working on Titanic. This is the final resting place of 27-year-old William Clark, also known as Billy. He died of pneumonia 2 days after suffering a fall from staging on Titanic, and he is buried here in this unmarked plot at the Carmody Main Cemetery. Although he was married, it's assumed his family couldn't really afford to erect a proper headstone, so here he lies, unmarked and forgotten, except by those within the Titanic community. Kind of sad, really. I've come back to Titanic's slipway because on May 31st, 1911, the completed hull of Titanic was launched from her slipway right over there, just into the waters of Belfast behind me here. Now, to facilitate in the launch of the ship, several workers were tasked with knocking out the giant wooden beams that held the ship upright upon the slipway. Titanic's launch was expected to be a triumphant success. However, for one man, it would be catastrophic. One of these giant wooden beams fell, crushing 43-year-old James Dobbin. James Dobbin had spent his whole life working here at the shipyard, and he was well known amongst his colleagues. His only son, 17-year-old, also called James, was an apprentice plumber here at Harland and Wolff. He had the day off, and along with his mother, they joined the people that lined the dockside here to watch Titanic's launch. They would have cheered triumphantly as their creation entered the waters here, completely unaware that their husband and father lay dying right here on Titanic's construction slipway. Lovely. The body of James Dobbin was brought here to Belfast City Cemetery, the same cemetery where the young Samuel Scott and John Kelly are buried just a short distance from here. He was buried right here in this family plot. Yet again, Titanic had claimed another life before she had even been put to sea. Sadly, it would not be the last.
The shipyard was one of the biggest employers in the city, so it comes as no surprise that generations from the same family often worked there. Sons followed fathers, fathers followed their fathers, and so on. A proud tradition of shipyard workers. The Murphy family was one such family. Robert Murphy, a rivet counter, and his son also, named Robert, both worked at the yard. Sadly, during the construction of the Olympic, Robert Jr. was killed in a work accident. But this would not be the only tragedy to hit the Murphy family.
On June 13th, 1911, Robert Sr. was working here on Titanic when the planks he was crossing suddenly parted and gave way. He fell 50 feet and died as a result of his injuries. One family, 2 members, both dying here at the shipyard, one on Titanic and one on her sister, the Olympic, in near identical tragic of circumstances. At 2 p.m. on the 15th of June, the funeral of Robert Murphy took place and his coffin was brought here from his home in the New Lodge area of Belfast to the Carmody Road Cemetery just outside the city, and he was buried right here in section J, plot D22, I believe it is, and he was laid to rest just right here. Now you may be wondering what happened to the families of the workmen killed during the construction. Did they receive anything from Harland and Wolff? Well, the answer to that is yes, of course they did. They weren't completely heartless. In total, there were 28 recorded serious incidences during the construction of Titanic, as well as 218 minor ones, all resulting in some form of injury. In total, Harland and Wolff ended up paying a compensation bill of £4,869. Now that might not seem a lot, but in today's money that would be worth just shy of £750,000. Of course, no amount of money could make up for the grief the family suffered at the loss of their loved one during the construction of Titanic.
Although many of the men featured in this episode are buried in unmarked graves, there is a place in this city that pays tribute to them all. On D Street, a short walk from the shipyard, a tablet dedicated to the workmen reads the following: "This plaque is to commemorate 8 brave men who lost their lives during the construction of RMS Titanic, built in Harland and Wolff Shipyard, Belfast."
As mentioned earlier, we know of at least 8 workmen who were killed during the construction of Titanic, 5 of whom we have some form of information on and we've explored in today's episode. Sadly, of the men lost during the construction of Titanic, they would soon be forgotten about, all except for the families and those who love them. The launch of Titanic and the Olympic class ships would completely overshadow any human loss here at the shipyard. Had the Titanic not suffered the fate she did, chances are those workmen, like most of us are destined to be, would have been completely forgotten about as time goes on. What I find most astonishing is that these men had absolutely no way of knowing the role they were playing in one of the greatest maritime events of all time. They were simply going to work, doing their day-to-day business, providing for their families. And with that said, I think it's a great place to wrap things up for today's episode. As usual, thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode, and don't forget to check out my other episodes from my Beyond the Titanic series. So, from a very wet Belfast, it's been raining all day today. I've had to dodge the showers, and I cannot begin to tell you how wet my feet are because I've recently discovered that these shoes leak. But hey ho, what can you do? Gives me an excuse to buy a new pair. So, as always, thank you for watching, much love, and I shall see you again on the next episode, whenever that may be. Take care, goodbye.